The truck's engine ticked as it cooled, and she sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking up at the elevator the way you might look at a church or an old friend's face after a long absence. The concrete tower still stood tall against the flat Kansas sky, its side lettering faded but legible if you knew where to look, and the tin roof caught the late afternoon sun in a way that made her squint. Somebody had painted the trim white last spring. She could tell because it hadn't chalked yet. She got out slow, the way a woman in her 60s gets out of anything, and stood with one hand still resting on the doorframe. The gravel lot had been graded since she'd last walked it, and a new sign hung by the scale house, hand-lettered but proud. Weighmaster on duty. She smiled at that. She'd painted it herself, years back, and somebody had kept it fresh. A boy on a bicycle slowed near the fence line, watching her the way kids watch anyone standing still too long in a small town. She lifted a hand to him and he pedaled on, satisfied she wasn't trouble. "I came here in the fall of 1994, she said out loud, though there was no one close enough to hear it, but the wind moving through the dead corn stubble across the road. 19 years old, with a duffel bag that had more holes in it than clothes, and a spot in a church coat closet that I'd earned by scrubbing floors and hauling hymnals." She let that sit in the air a moment, like she was testing whether the words still fit right, the way you'd test a stair tread before putting your full weight on it. The elevator loomed the same as it always had, patient and gray, though its bones were sounder now than in years. She remembered how it had looked the first time she saw it. Condemned, sealed, ignored by everyone but the wind, which had a way of hollowing out anything left too long to itself. She remembered thinking it was just another closed door in a town full of them, another place that didn't want her, until she went looking for scrap wire and found something else entirely. She started walking toward the dump pit door, boots finding the same worn path they'd found for years, and behind her the truck ticked once more, settling. "People ask me sometimes how I ended up the keeper of a grain elevator nobody wanted," she said, more to the building now than to herself. "They think it's a strange thing for a drifter to become. But it wasn't luck, and it wasn't chance neither, not really. It was a room somebody kept alive underground for years, waiting on someone who needed it as much as it needed them." She reached the door, put her palm flat against the cool steel, and let herself remember exactly how it had started. Not with a treasure, but with a hatch, and a smell of oil that shouldn't have still been fresh. The summer of 1994 had settled over the town like dust that never quite lifted, and she remembered how the church basement smelled that August. Candle wax and old hymnals, and the mildew that crept into everything left near the crick. She'd been there 3 weeks by then, sleeping in the coat closet off the fellowship hall on a folded quilt, paying her way with sweeping and dishwashing and whatever else pastor's wife needed done before the Wednesday potluck. It wasn't much of a life, but it was dry, and dry counted for something when you'd spent the spring sleeping in the back of other people's trucks and the corners of bus stations 2 counties over. She'd heard about the copper from a boy stacking hymnals, who'd heard it from his uncle, who used to work the elevator before it shut its doors for good. Wire fetched good money at the scrapyard in the next town over, and money was the one thing she never had enough of, not for shoes, not for the bus fare that might have taken her somewhere with more promise than this shrinking place had left to offer. So on a Tuesday afternoon, with the sun beating flat and white against the wheat stubble, she'd walked the mile out past the rail spur to where the elevator stood against the sky like something that had given up standing straight. "Condemned," the county sign said, nailed crooked to the loading door, its red paint gone pink with weather. Nobody minded much if a person slipped past a condemned sign in a town like that. There wasn't anybody left to mind. She'd found the gap where a board had rotted loose near the base, squeezed through sideways, and stood a long moment letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. breathing in must and grain dust, and something underneath that she couldn't yet name. The inside of the place had a hollowed-out grandeur to it, tall as a barn but narrower, ladders and catwalks disappearing up into shadow, the old dump pit yawning open at her feet, where trucks used to back in and unload their loads of wheat and milo. She'd picked her way carefully, testing boards before she trusted them, looking for the copper wiring the boy's uncle swore still ran along the old motor housings. That was when she noticed it, down near the pit's edge, half hidden behind a fallen support beam, a seam in the concrete floor that didn't belong to any blueprint a building like this ought to have. A hatch, steel, bolted down tight, and hinges on it that caught the little light coming through the roof slats and threw it back too clean, too bright, for something that should have been rusted shut for years. She crouched at the edge of the pit and touched the hinge with one finger, half expecting the grease to be some old residue baked hard by time, the way everything else in that building had gone brittle and gray. But it came away slick on her skin, dark and faintly smelling of machine oil, the kind you'd find on a tractor that had run that morning. Her stomach did something strange, not quite fear, more like the feeling of reading a sentence twice, because the first time through, it hadn't made sense. She sat back on her heels and made herself think it through, the way her father used to make her think through a stuck gate hinge or a mule that wouldn't load. Not with her hands first, but with her eyes. The hatch was maybe 3 feet square, flush with the concrete. A heavy ring bolt sunk into steel, gone dull everywhere except along the seams, where somebody had clearly worked a rag or a brush. 4 bolts held it down, old pattern, square-headed, the kind that took a particular wrench she didn't have. No padlock, no chain. Whoever tended it hadn't been worried about strangers, only about weather or dust, or maybe the cold. She went back out through the gap in the boards to the truck she'd been borrowing chores off of, and dug through the toolbox in back until she found a rusted crescent wrench and a length of pipe long enough to give her leverage. It took the better part of an hour. The first bolt fought her hardest, and by the time it gave, her palms had gone raw and she'd torn a fingernail down to the quick without noticing until she saw the blood on the wrench handle. She worked the second and third loose faster, falling into a rhythm, testing the angle, bracing her boot against the beam, throwing her whole thin weight into it. The last bolt spun free almost gently, as if it had been waiting for her rather than resisting her, and she sat back, breathing hard, sweat cooling on her neck, despite the November chill leaking through the elevator's broken siding. She worked her fingers under the lip of the hatch and pulled. It resisted a moment, seal breaking with a soft suck of displaced air, and then it swung up easier than 400 pounds of steel had any right to, hinges turning without so much as a whisper of complaint. Cool air rose to meet her, dry and strangely clean, nothing like the dust and rot of the elevator floor around her. She knelt at the edge and looked down into darkness that seemed to swallow the gray daylight whole, a set of iron rungs bolted into a narrow shaft leading straight down. Somewhere below, she thought she heard the faint tick of something metal settling, the way a stove ticks after the fire's gone out. She sat very still, listening, and then reached for the flashlight she'd tucked into her coat pocket that morning without quite knowing why she'd need it. The flashlight's beam caught dust motes hanging perfectly still in the shaft, undisturbed by any draft, which struck her as odd before she understood why. The space below was sealed tight enough that nothing moved unless she moved it. She swung her legs over the edge and found the first rung with her boot, testing her weight before committing, the way she'd learned to test everything since she'd stopped trusting the world to hold her up. The iron was cold but solid, no rust flaking under her grip, and she counted 12 rungs down before her feet touched packed earth and old brick. She turned, and the light found a room that made her breath catch somewhere behind her ribs. It was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, walls lined with brick and something else beneath, tar paper, she'd learn later, packed with sawdust for insulation, the kind of work a patient man did when he had nowhere else he needed to be. A narrow cot sat against the far wall, blanket folded at its foot with hospital corners, as if someone expected to sleep there again before the week was out. Beside it, a kerosene lamp sat on an upturned crate, and when she lifted it and shook it gently, fuel sloshed inside, more than half full. Her light traveled along a shelf built into the wall, sagging slightly under the weight of books. Thick manuals with cracked spines, titles stamped in gold gone dull with age. Grain handling and storage procedures. Railway scale maintenance and calibration. Interstate Commerce Commission Weighmaster's Handbook, 1961 edition. She ran her fingers along them the way she might touch something sacred, not quite believing they were real, that anything down here was real, and not some fever dream brought on by cold and hunger and too many nights sleeping upright in a closet that smelled of mothballs and communion wine. Tucked between two of the thickest volumes, she found a logbook bound in cracked leather, its pages soft with handling. She opened it under the flashlight's beam and saw columns, dates, weights, names she didn't recognize, notes in a small, careful hand that slanted slightly to the left. She flipped forward, watching the years climb. 1971, 1976, 1982. The same handwriting unbroken through all of it, steady as a heartbeat, until the entries simply stopped in the spring of 1988, with no explanation, no farewell, just the last line ending mid-sentence, as if the writer had meant to return, and never had. She sat down slowly on the edge of the cot, the logbook open in her lap, and looked around at the room again. Dry, warm compared to the wind outside, smelling faintly of kerosene and old paper, and something like cedar. Someone had built this, someone had kept it, and judging by the dust that hadn't yet settled on the lamp's glass chimney, someone might have been keeping it far more recently than she wanted to believe possible. She made herself move, because sitting still too long in a warm place after weeks of cold was a kind of danger all its own. The body forgets it has anywhere else to be. She swept the flashlight along the walls, counting what she found, the way she'd learned to count anything that might matter later, methodically, without hoping too hard. A wood stove sat bolted against the far wall, its flue rising through a chase cut cleanly into the stone above, drawing air from somewhere she couldn't see, venting smoke to somewhere she couldn't see either, and that alone told her this room hadn't been some forgotten afterthought bricked up and abandoned. Somebody had engineered it to be lived in. Behind a curtain of burlap sacking, she found a shelf of canned goods, the labels faded but readable, beans, tomatoes, peaches in syrup, stacked with the kind of care that suggested rotation rather than hoarding, older cans pushed to the back, newer ones near the front. She picked one up, no dust on the lid. Her stomach tightened, not with fear exactly, but with the sharpening awareness that she was standing inside somebody else's ongoing life, not a ruin. There were tools, too, hung on nails along a beam, a crescent wrench, a set of screwdrivers with worn wooden handles, a coil of wire, a hand auger for boring through wood. Everything oiled, everything in its place, the way her grandfather used to keep his shed before the bank took the shed along with everything else. She ran a thumb over the crescent wrench and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something close to safety. She sat back down on the cot and made herself think it through the way she'd think through any decision that mattered, slowly, without letting the wanting get ahead of the reasoning. If she told anyone about this, the town council or whoever still held paper on the condemned elevator, they'd seal it inside a week. Someone would call it a liability, a trespassing hazard. Kids could get hurt down here, and the hatch would be welded shut, and that would be that. Whoever had kept this room alive for years past the elevator's official death, kept the lamp filled, kept the cans rotated, kept the stove ready, would lose whatever this was, and so would she, before she'd even had the chance to understand what it was. She wasn't stealing. She told herself that plainly, the way she told herself most hard truths, because lying to herself was a luxury she couldn't afford. She wasn't stealing anything from anyone who was using it. She was only borrowing warmth that had been sitting here, patient and unclaimed, waiting on a person who plainly hadn't come back in 6 years. She would be careful. She would be quiet. She would learn what this place wanted from her before she let the world know it existed at all. She blew out a slow breath, watched it fog faintly in the lamp's dying warmth, and began, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to plan instead of merely survive. The plan she made that first night held up better than most plans do, which surprised her enough that she wrote it down on the back page of one of the manuals, in pencil, small, the way you'd hide a confession: mornings for the church, afternoons for the elevator, evenings for reading by lamplight until her eyes burned. She kept the coat closet as her official address, such as it was, because a girl who vanished from the pews would draw questions faster than one who simply looked tired, and tired was easy to explain in a town like that. The room itself asked for patience more than labor. She swept the floor with a broom made from a broken rake handle and a bundle of stiff grass, careful not to raise dust that might drift up through the hatch and give her away. She checked the kerosene level against a pencil mark she scratched into the lamp's brass base, rationing it the way she rationed everything, a little each night. Never enough to be missed. Never enough to run dry. The canned goods she left untouched at first, then began rotating the way the shelf itself suggested someone once had, oldest to the front, a system built by a mind that didn't like waste any more than she did. The logbook became her real work. She read it the way she imagined a person might read a Bible they didn't yet believe in, hunting less for miracles than for instructions. Most entries were plain: weights, dates, weather, a wagon's name, a farmer's initials, but scattered through them were notes to himself, reminders about calibration, about how the beam scale drifted a few pounds heavy in cold weather and needed adjusting, about which hay was green enough to dock a nickel a bale. She copied these into the back pages of her own head, turning phrases over at night until they made sense, until she could have recited the calibration steps in her sleep. She started asking around town, careful and sideways, the way you learn to ask things when you have no right to be asking. She asked the diner cook who used to run the elevator scale before it shut. She asked the hardware store owner if anyone still had keys to the place. She asked the pastor, gently, over dishes, whether he remembered the last weighmaster's name. The answers came slow and thin, the way information does in a town that's forgotten more than it remembers. A name surfaced once, vague, second-hand. An old man, kept to himself, walked with a limp. Another time, nothing but a shrug and a story about the elevator closing, sometime after the railroad quit caring. She filed each scrap away like a bale she was stacking for later, not sure yet what shape the stack would take, only that it was growing, and that somewhere beneath all these second-hand memories was a name written plainly enough, if she looked hard enough, to lead her to a door. The name finally came clear on a Tuesday, when the county clerk's office let her look through the old plat book, the one with the water stains along the spine that nobody had opened in years. She found the elevator listed there, its acreage and lot number matching the deed she'd traced from the newspaper's morgue files, and beside it, in cramped ledger handwriting, a string of tax lien notices going back further than she'd expected. The place hadn't just closed. It had been quietly drowning in unpaid assessments for a decade. The ownership passed between a grain cooperative that dissolved and a holding company that seemed to exist only on paper, its address a post office box 2 counties over. She was still copying the lot numbers into her notebook when the door opened behind her and a man in a canvas coat walked in, smelling of diesel and impatience. He introduced himself as the caretaker for the company that held the paper on the elevator now, though he said it the way a man says something he's decided to believe rather than something he knows. He'd heard, he said, that someone had been poking around the property, asking questions. He didn't like it. Liability, he said. Insurance. The building was a hazard, condemned, slated for sealing and clearance before the next growing season, and if she or anyone else was thinking about squatting in a condemned structure, she ought to think again, because the county wasn't going to look kindly on it, and neither was he. She kept her face still, and her voice steadier than she felt, and told him she was only researching old grain records for a history project, which was true enough not to be a lie. He looked at her the way men sometimes did when they'd already decided what kind of trouble a girl like her must be, and said the elevator would be fenced within the month, boarded proper, maybe torn down after that if the county didn't want the liability sitting out there rusting. He said it like a warning. She took it as a deadline. Walking back toward the church that evening, past the elevator's long shadow stretching gray across the gravel lot, she understood the shape the stack of scraps had been building toward all along. It wasn't only a name she needed now, it was proof of a claim, a right, something with enough weight to stand against tax liens and company paperwork, and a caretaker eager to see the whole place erased before anyone could ask why a room beneath the dump pit had a fresh coat of grease on its hinges. She thought of the logbook entries dated years past the closing, of the wood stove flue swept clean, of oil that hadn't dried out on its own. Somebody had fought to keep that place alive long after the county had given up on it. She meant to find out why, and whether there was still time to keep it standing. The county nursing home sat on the north edge of the next town over, a low brick building with a flagpole out front and a parking lot half full of cars with dust on their windshields. She'd walked 6 miles to get there, the manual with the scratched name tucked inside her coat like something that might blow away if she wasn't careful with it. The name at the front desk got her a raised eyebrow and a slow nod toward a hallway that smelled like bleach and overcooked vegetables. He was sitting by a window when she found him, a thin man with hands spotted brown and a blanket over knees that didn't seem to hold much weight anymore. She said the name from the manual and watched something in his face shift, the way a held breath finally lets go. He asked how she knew it, and she told him about the hatch, the grease on the hinges, the logbook with its careful lines running years past where any official record said the elevator had gone quiet. He was quiet himself a long moment. Then he asked her to sit, and she did, and he told her the elevator had been his whole working life before it closed, weighing wagons and then trucks for every farm within 20 miles, keeping the scale honest when honesty mattered to men who lived and died by a fair number. When the company shut it down, he'd kept a set of keys nobody thought to ask for back. He said the town needed that scale even after the paperwork said it didn't, and there wasn't anybody left to argue different, so he just kept coming, swept the flue, oiled the hinges, slept down there some nights when his own house felt too big and too quiet. He didn't call it charity. He called it upkeep, like a fence line or a roof, something that falls apart if a person stops tending it. Nobody paid him. Nobody knew, except maybe the ones who noticed hayloads still got weighed square long after they shouldn't have been able to. She asked him why he'd stopped, and his eyes went to the window, to nothing in particular. Said his legs gave out on the ladder one winter, and he never trusted them again after that, and the county came for him not long after and put him here, and he supposed the room was still down there keeping itself, the way things do when nobody's around to remind them they're finished. She told him about the caretaker, the fence, the deadline shaped like a warning. His jaw tightened at that, the first sharp thing she'd seen in him. He said there were papers, once, certification, official, filed proper with his name on them as weighmaster, and if the company had let those slide out of their records, that was the company's carelessness, not the truth of the matter. She leaned forward. "Papers?" she asked. "Where?" He didn't answer right away. His hands, folded on the blanket, opened and closed once, like he was working the shape of something back into his fingers after a long time of them being idle. Then he told her to look under the third board from the wall, the one nearest where the cot used to sit, the one that never quite matched the others because he'd cut it himself with a handsaw one autumn when the original had rotted through from a leak nobody ever fixed proper. He said it would give a little if she pressed the left corner first, the way a plank does when the nail beneath it has worked loose over the years, and once it gave, she'd find a gap deep enough for a cigar box, though he'd never smoked, and couldn't say now where the box had come from, except that it seemed the right size for what needed keeping. Inside, he said, she'd find 2 keys on a loop of baling twine, one for the man door at the base of the elevator, and one for a padlock that hadn't been used since before she was likely born. Beneath the keys, wrapped in a page torn from a feed catalog to keep the damp off, sat the fittings for the coal stove flue, the ones he'd pulled out one summer to clean and never got around to setting back before his legs quit on him. And under all of that, flat against the boards, the certification papers themselves, folded twice, his name typed clean across the bottom, beside a county seal he said used to mean something to people who still bothered to check. He wanted her to understand he hadn't hidden them out of secrecy. He'd hidden them the way a man puts good tools away from weather, so they'd still be sound when someone came looking. He said he'd always figured somebody might, someday, need that room more than he did, and he'd wanted it ready. Not preserved like a museum, not sealed up like a grave, but kept warm, was the phrase he used, like a stove banked overnight, so the coals hold till morning. He said it twice, like he wanted her to carry the words out of the room with her, exactly as he'd given them. She sat with that for a moment, turning the weight of it over the way she'd once turned engine parts to check for wear. Then she asked him, plainly, whether he'd sign something himself, in his own hand, if it came to that. His eyes moved to the window again, and this time they didn't wander. "Bring me the paper," he said, "and I'll write what needs writing. Won't be the first time my name's gone down on something for that elevator, and I don't expect it'll be the last." She brought the paper the following Tuesday, typed clean on the church office's old Smith Corona, the wording plain and careful the way she imagined a judge would want it, a statement of maintenance, of unbroken service, of intent to see the property cared for rather than cleared. He read it twice, lips moving faintly over the words, and then he signed it with a hand that shook but didn't waver from the line. His signature, the same tight, sloped hand she'd read 100 times in the logbook. Seeing it there on fresh paper instead of yellowed ledger stock made something settle in her chest, like a key finally turning all the way. The county clerk's office smelled of carbon paper and radiator heat. The woman behind the counter had the patient weariness of someone who had spent a career untangling other people's inheritances, and she listened without interrupting, while Junie laid out the certification papers, the notarized statement, and the logbook itself, its spine soft from handling. The clerk paged through the entries slowly, pausing at the 1988 date as though she were doing arithmetic in her head, matching it against whatever quiet paperwork had let the county forget the elevator existed at all. The caretaker from the grain company came in halfway through, boots loud on the tile, holding a clipboard like a shield. He said his company held salvage rights, that the structure was slated for clearing before the county could lien it for scrap value, that a girl sleeping in a coat closet had no standing to claim a maintenance lease on a building that had been condemned since before she'd arrived in town. He wasn't unkind about it, just certain, the way men get when paperwork has always sided with them before. Junie didn't argue with him. She let the papers argue instead. The certification signed decades ago, still valid under a county code nobody had bothered to repeal, and beneath it, a fresh line of ink proving the last certified weighmaster was alive, of sound mind, and testifying that the room and scale had never stopped being tended. The clerk turned the certification over, checked a ledger of her own, and said, quietly, that a maintenance lease predating salvage claims would hold, provided the current occupant kept the terms, safety, upkeep, and use, consistent with the original purpose. The caretaker's jaw worked for a moment before he nodded, short and clipped, and said he'd noted in his file that the company had bigger elevators to worry about than one nobody had operated in years anyway. He left without looking back at her, and the door's bell rattled after him like something exhaling. The clerk stamped the lease and slid it across the counter, still warm from the machine. Junie folded it into her coat pocket beside the logbook, feeling for the first time that the room beneath the hatch was hers not by discovery, but by law, and that the real work, restoring what had only been kept warm, was only just beginning. The stove came apart easier than it went back together. She'd hauled the firebox up into daylight to scrape decades of clinker from its throat, and for 2 days the pieces lay spread across the elevator floor like a puzzle only one man alive had ever solved. She found the answer in his manuals, in margins where he'd noted which bolt stripped if you forced it, which gasket to cut fresh from gutter flashing when the old one crumbled. By the time smoke drew clean up the flue again, her knuckles were scabbed and black, and the room held heat for the first time in 6 years. The scale took longer. She oiled the beam bearings the way the manual showed, hung known weights from a borrowed truck axle, and adjusted the poise until the balance held true against numbers scratched in his own hand from a calibration decades old. When she finally set a neighbor's hay wagon on the platform and watched the beam settle without a shudder, she felt something settle in her chest to match it. Word moved slow in a town that size, but it moved. A farmer needing his round bales weighed for a buyer in the next county became 2, then 5, then a standing line most Saturday mornings, men in seed corn caps counting bills into her palm, glancing past her at the lamp glow leaking up through the hatch, asking without asking how a girl came to be running the old elevator's scale. She never explained more than she had to. She let the ticket book and the steady beam do the talking. Evenings she spent making the room livable rather than merely survivable. A shelf built from elevator scrap for her few clothes, a rug traded for chore work laid over the cold floor, the cot's blanket washed until it stopped smelling of dust and started smelling like something she owned. She kept the kerosene lamp lit low even after she'd wired in a single bulb because the old light felt like company. Sundays she carried the logbook to the nursing home, its cover soft now from handling, and read him his own words back across a table by the window. He'd close his eyes at certain entries: a hard frost in 61, a boxcar derailment in 73, and correct her pronunciation of names she'd never have found in any record. Some Sundays he slept before she finished a page. She read anyway, quieter, so as not to wake him, letting the sentences fall into the room like grain settling into a bin, finding their own level. Outside his window, the wheat came up gold that year, the same as every year, indifferent to elevators and hatches and girls who'd stopped drifting. She went back to town each week a little more fixed in place, the way a scale settles once it's been trued, no longer swinging, no longer guessing, just holding steady under whatever weight came to rest on it. She tells this part of the story slower than the rest, the way she tells it every time someone new stands in the scale house and asks how a 19-year-old drifter ended up owning a grain elevator nobody else wanted. He passed the winter after the wheat came up gold. Quietly, in his sleep, the nursing home said, on a Tuesday when she hadn't been scheduled to visit. She went anyway that Sunday, logbook under her arm out of habit, and sat by the window a long while before anyone told her. Afterward, she kept reading to the empty chair for a few minutes, because it seemed wrong to stop mid-sentence on a man who'd never once left a job half-finished. She buried the cover-worn logbook in cedar oil to keep the leather from cracking, the way his manuals had taught her, and set it back on its shelf in the weighmaster's room, not in a drawer, not in a box, where it had always lived, where it could go on being read. The scale still runs. She trued it herself that first autumn, and has retrued it every spring since, the way the manuals said to, the way he'd have wanted it done. Farmers still bring hay and grain down the same gravel road that used to lead to nothing but a condemned building and a locked door. She weighs their loads, writes the numbers in a ledger of her own now, separate from his but sitting on the same shelf, because a thing worth keeping is worth adding to. The room below the dump pit is still hers. The lease made it hers on paper, the county made it hers on record, but it was hers before any of that, from the first night she lit the kerosene lamp low just to hear it hiss. She sleeps there still, though she's long past sleeping in coat closets, long past owning nothing. The cot's been replaced twice. The stove still runs on coal when the electric heater falters, because some things are worth keeping the old way. People ask her sometimes if she ever regrets it. A life built underground, in a building most of the county had already written off. She tells them what she came to understand slowly, the way grain settles, that what she found under that hatch wasn't a hiding place at all. A hiding place is built to be forgotten. This had been built to be found. Oiled hinges, a lamp with fuel left in it, a logbook kept current until the very edge of someone's strength ran out. Somebody had spent years keeping a room warm for a girl he'd never met, trusting the town or the wheat, or whatever passes for Providence out here, to eventually send her down that hatch. It sent her, and she stayed,